Emoji. All right, everybody, let's get started. So we are in a new PowerPoint. I've already uploaded this PowerPoint to Canvas, so you're welcome to look through it on your own if you like. But we'll go over everything that you need to know from this one. I'm going to try and move rather quickly, but the first little part's going to be a little slow. So to start this unit off, well, we're still in the same unit, but to start this next segment of the unit off, we're talking a little bit about socialism. All right, socialism, and so let's just have a quick conversation here about socialism. It's a term that I think people get easily confused on, and may not have a complete idea of what it means. Now, maybe you've heard of socialism before. Now, here in the United States, socialism is a word that, if you basically, as a politician, if you get labeled a socialist, your career is in jeopardy. Because here in the United States, socialism is something that a lot of people feel very defensive about, I guess. Now, the first thing that we need to be clear about is that socialism and communism are not quite the same thing, and even socialism itself is a word, depending on what era in history you're using that word in, the context that you're using that word in. The definition of socialism changes and evolves over time. There are different kinds of socialism. So that's what makes it kind of a confusing term, because if we just speak about socialism using it as kind of a blanket term, there are some commonalities, but generally speaking, socialism kind of manifests differently at different points in history. So let's talk a little bit about it. First of all, to give you this slide here, who is the proletariat? Okay, that term where it says social classes, proletariat. The proletariat is a catch-all term to describe basically working class people, urban workers, and even agricultural workers, peasants and stuff. And the reason that socialism generally appeals to the proletariat is that broadly, in places where peasants' lives are most oppressive, or urban workers' lives are most oppressive, socialism starts to become appealing to them. I don't want to confuse you too much, because socialism, if we're looking at a political spectrum, socialism falls on the left side of things. And I've already told you that peasants a lot of times fall on the right side of things. Peasants tend to be pretty conservative, all right? So how come is it then that not all of them are? Well, in particular, where peasants' lives start to become very brutal, or more specifically, we usually think of socialism as dealing with urban workers rather than peasants. Peasants tend to be more conservative and want less change. But as the Industrial Revolution progresses, particularly people start migrating from those rural areas to urban areas and taking jobs in factories and things like that, and their lives become pretty miserable in the early going of industrialization. And very quickly, people start looking to the government to start making changes that will improve the quality of life for the grossly overpopulated regions of these urban areas that are starting to grow as the Industrial Revolution progresses. And one of the earliest forms of socialism was known as utopian socialism. And when we think about that word utopia, remember, a utopia is trying to create a perfect society, right? Utopian socialists. And in that sense, this early form of socialism, utopian socialism, mixes well with romanticism, because once again, people kind of have this flowery, overly idealized vision of what socialism would look like, how it would manifest. And it's not particularly realistic, okay? So early utopian socialists, and just in general, socialism on a broad scale, I think it's pretty fair to make this statement. Generally speaking, I think a lot of people still have pretty flowery ideas about socialism. If people subscribe to socialist ideas in modern day times, I would still argue that probably for the most part they are pretty idealistic. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Idealism can be a good thing, because it can. It's the spirit behind it is trying to improve society and make society a better place. But there are some very real problems with socialism as well, if not implemented appropriately. And we'll talk about what some of those issues are as we continue to progress and talk about this today. But let's talk a little bit about socialism, and in particular, I'd like to mention a few things about it. First of all, so if we're speaking broadly, the reason that socialism and liberalism, for example, don't play well with one another, don't mix well, the liberals in society at this time, classical liberals, okay, in the 30s or whatever, classical liberals are about keeping the government out of the economy, right? Laissez-faire. We've talked about this many, many times now before. Socialists are just the opposite. Socialists want the government to intervene. They want the government to make laws that mostly benefit people who are everyday workers, all right? Remember that the bourgeoisie is the group of people who most commonly subscribe to liberal ideas. The bourgeoisie being upper middle class folks, factory owners, relatively educated people who are relatively well off, and they want to see the government stay out of the economy. Socialists are relatively poor off people, the proletariat, urban workers. They obviously make up a much larger segment of the population than the bourgeoisie. And as these ideas of socialism continue to progress throughout the Industrial Revolution, by the time that we get to 1848, which is a very magical, special year for Euro because of all the revolutions that start breaking out, new ideas, more radical ideas surrounding socialism start to be published by various authors, but most importantly, the most famous author would be Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was a German philosopher. We need to be clear about that. Karl Marx is a German political philosopher. And let me just explain why Karl Marx is so significant here. He wrote a book, a pamphlet, a political pamphlet by the name of the Communist Manifesto. Okay, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx in 1848, same year as the revolutions. By 1848, the Industrial Revolution has been around now for several decades. And as we know, in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, which we learned about last unit, the Industrial Revolution resulted in the, really severely oppressive treatment of many of these working class people. We talked about how in the early going of industrialization, the population saw a dramatic drop in life expectancy. We saw brutal living and working conditions, overpopulation, pollution, disease spreading around. It's kind of a giant nightmare. And the population who is suffering from these conditions starts to become angry. Karl Marx was above and beyond being a political philosopher, he was a historian. And Karl Marx had studied the most significant historical event that had happened up to that point in his life, which was the French Revolution. And when Karl Marx studied the French Revolution, he looked at it from the angle of economics. So from Persia categories, he was very much an economic and social guy. And in his analysis of the French Revolution, Karl Marx came to the conclusion that class warfare was inevitable. And he said, if you take a look at the French Revolution, the class warfare that took place was between the nobles, the nobility, the aristocratic powers that be, who were at the top of society before the French Revolution started, and a social class of bourgeois members became aware, they became conscious of their political oppression. And when they became conscious of their political oppression, they came together and they ran this revolution that resulted in the dethroning of the king. It resulted in the deseating of the aristocratic population as the top of society, and the new top of society became the bourgeoisie. And he said that the same thing would happen when the proletariat, the newly oppressed class of urban workers during the Industrial Revolution, would become aware of their political and social oppression. The proletariat would band together and inevitably wage war, just as the bourgeoisie did against the aristocratic powers that be during the French Revolution. He said that it was inevitable that the working class would bind together and overthrow the bourgeoisie ruling class and establish a completely equal, egalitarian society. And this idea is what he referred to as communism, which is like socialism to the extreme. All right. So class warfare is a major part of the Communist Manifesto. Communism as a political philosophy is an attempt to create a completely classless society where everybody is equal and shares according to their need. And Karl Marx was making a prediction in 1848. And if you think about the context that he was in, he saw a lot of miserable people who were suffering at the hands of industrialization. It was a rather logical prediction to make. However, one of the things that Karl Marx could never have predicted at the time that he wrote the Communist Manifesto was that as in the decades that followed the Communist Manifesto, governments began implementing, in the name of actually conservative reforms, implementing reforms in society that gradually improved the living and working conditions of the proletariat. And as the government started making small baby step changes, reforms, over time, people's hostility and anger about their relatively oppressed lives started to diminish as their lives became less oppressive. And so communism, as Karl Marx predicted in 1848, has never, if you will, manifested in the way that he thought that it would. That is not to say that we haven't seen, though, communist rhetoric and communist political revolutions happen. They do happen in certain places. It happens probably first in the Soviet Union. Very shortly after, it spreads to China. We see communist revolutions happen in Cuba and various other places around the planet, Vietnam, and so on. However, in each of these communist revolutions that have taken place, they've never happened quite the way that Marx said that they would. And we'll talk more about that. We're not there yet, but I'm trying to set this up so that you have a little bit of previous knowledge once we do start talking about communist revolutions coming up in the next 50 to 70 years within the class, how they're different from what Karl Marx said would happen. So Karl Marx's predictions were not true. They did not come true. And where communism has happened, the aims of communism to create an equal society where everybody shares according to their need have never really come true. Communism has ultimately resulted in totalitarian states, dictators, and social classes have not disappeared as Marx said that they would when communism is put into place in these various places. So, but let's take it back. Okay, so that's communism, but let's take it back to socialism, because that's really kind of what starts off, all of this, all of the things that I've been talking about. It all kind of begins with this idea known as utopian socialism. So what I'd like you to do, I already put a document up. It's available to you. It's over here on Canvas. If you go to Canvas, to the Files section, it's right in the main Files section. It says utopiansocialism.pdf. And I'd like you to open that file up and follow along as we start to look through some of this here. Now, this is a rather long document. I'm not going to have you read the entire thing necessarily, but the first few pages of it are, well, I don't know. The whole thing is quite good. And this will really pretty much tell you everything that you need to know about the utopian socialists. And the guys that you would want to name or to remember from this unit as being associated with utopian socialists are the following people: Charles Fourier, a guy named Duc de Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. Okay, and so these three guys are kind of the forebearers to utopian socialist thought that influenced Karl Marx in his own career as a political philosopher to write the Communist Manifesto, which kind of took the ideas and turned them into a whole new political platform known as communism. But all of it was very much influenced by the utopian socialists. So let's just read through this together a little bit. By 1825, so keep in mind that's still pretty early on in the Industrial Revolution, By 1825, European society had undergone several shock waves of change. The transformation was set in motion by two immense revolutions. One set the pace for political change in the 19th century, while the other radically transformed the nature of economic man. As we have seen, the French Revolution made change the order of the day and helped to instill in man, or at least some men, the notion that change was somehow both good and desirable. Occurring at the same time, although with a varied pace depending upon what European nation we are observing, an industrial revolution worked its wonders on nations, social classes, and individuals. Although there were those thinkers who were critical of the Industrial Revolution and wanted to return to some pre-modern state of existence, there were other critics who saw that industry and industrial capitalism were here to stay. For these individuals, it was a forward-looking socialism which would help make sense of all of these changes for the benefit of mankind. However, it is curious to note that following the Napoleonic period, a strong wave of conservative reactions set in across most of Europe. We've been talking about that with the Congress of Vienna. This is not that surprising, since most monarchs feared what another French Revolution or another Napoleon could do in their country. The first quarter of the 19th century was also marked by an artistic and cultural phenomenon known as Romanticism. The Romantic artists idealized medieval society and, in general, exhibited a strong distaste for rationalism of any flavor. The Romantic also had no sympathy for the atomized individualism that was so prominent among the philosophers. Therefore, Romanticism also lent itself to conservative and reactionary purposes. But since Romanticism also meant the attempt to break away from established norms and standards in art, conduct, and philosophy, it could also seem to have served the purposes of liberation that was embraced by the radical and revolutionary socialists. And I've talked with you guys about this before. We talked about how Romanticism could be applied, depending on how you're talking about it, to either conservatives or to radical progressives of the time. Romanticism was so complex a movement that historians have never reached a consensus regarding definitions or meanings. Romantics were liberals, conservatives, rationalists, idealists, Catholics, atheists, revolutionaries, and reactionaries. Their essential message, however, was that the imagination of the individual should determine the form and content of all art. Such an attitude ran counter to the judgments of the Enlightenment. The philosophers attacked the church because it blocked human reason. The Romantics attacked the philosophers because they had turned man into a soulless thinking machine, a robot. Christianity had formed a matrix into which medieval man found understanding. The Enlightenment replaced the medieval matrix with the matrix of Newtonian physics. For the Romantics, the result of all of this was the demotion of the individual. Imagination, sensitivity, feeling, spontaneity, and freedom were stifled, choked to death. Man must liberate himself. Like Rousseau, one of their spiritual fathers, and we've talked about Rousseau as an Enlightenment figure, but sometimes people call Rousseau the beginning of intellectual romanticism. He said the individual must rediscover true freedom. Habits, rules, traditions, and standards imposed by rational society must be lifted. Man must be liberated. The philosophers tried to demonstrate that all men are the same because they are endowed with reason. But where the philosophers saw commonality, the Romantics saw diversity and uniqueness. Discover yourself, they said. Express yourself. Play your own music. Write your own poetry. Paint your own personal vision. Live, love, or suffer in your own way. Whereas the 18th century philosopher would have agreed with Kant, Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, when he said, "Dare to know," the Romantics took up the battle cry, "Dare to be yourself." The Romantics were rebels, and they knew it. They dared to be themselves, and they were most passionate about their subjectivism, their emphasis on the introspective self. After all, had not Rousseau's Confessions begun with the following words: "I am commencing an undertaking hitherto without precedent, and which will never find an imitator. I desire to set before my fellows the likeness of a man in all the truth of nature, and that man myself alone. I know the feelings of my heart, and I know men. I am not made like any of those I have seen. I venture to believe that I am not made like any of those who are in existence. If I am not better, at least I am different." For the Romantic, it was poetry which revealed the highest truth. Poetry could do what rational analysis and geometric calculation could not. Poetry could speak to the heart, clarify life's mysteries, and bring the imagination out of the soul. "Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts," said John Keats. "Bathe in the waters of life," said William Blake. The Romantics gave European culture an antidote to the excessive rationalism of the 18th century. Intensely subjective and introspective, the Romantics discovered the soul behind the mind. It was in the context of the Romantic movement, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, that the utopian socialists made their appearance upon the historical stage. The three main utopian socialists, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Henry, or otherwise known as Duc de Saint-Simon, differed from one another in a number of fundamental ways, but they had enough in common to justify talking about them collectively. They all lived at approximately the same time. Only 12 years separated the oldest, Saint-Simon, from the youngest, Charles Fourier. All were alive between 1770 and 1825, and they all did their most influential work during the first quarter of the 19th century. Although it was Marx and Engels who eventually labeled these socialists as utopian, as outlined in the Communist Manifesto, they were not utopian in the sense that Sir Thomas More certainly was. The utopian socialists believed that their ideal societies could be established in the immediate future. More, on the other hand, could only admit that the island called Utopia was an ideal society, but also that the only way England or Europe could find its utopia was to go back in time rather than forward. This much said, the label utopian has been accepted, but not necessarily because historians have agreed with the judgment of Marx and Engels. The real reason why Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen are utopian socialists is because their thought closely resembles that of the religious sectarian, the recent convert, the visionary, and the romantic. It might also be added that for the modern, the ideas of the utopian socialists appear to have been formulated by fanatics. This is perhaps a result of the fact that they announced their plans for an ideal society with the zeal of a religious prophet. Appearing as they did in the first quarter of the 19th century, it is necessary to identify the utopian socialists according to how perceptively they understood and dealt with the massive challenge of industrial society. In this regard, it was Charles Fourier who seems to have been the most utopian of the utopian socialists. What I mean by this is that although Fourier was aware of what was happening in England as a result of the Industrial Revolution, he rejected industrialization wholesale. He despised laissez-faire liberalism and the factory system, not because of what effects they might have on human society, but because he believed that industrial society was a passing phase. He saw no need to rectify the dangers inherent in industrialism. He simply went beyond industrialism by ignoring it. Visionaries can do such things, you know. As a visionary, Fourier's ideas seem quite fantastical and without ground in reality. Indeed, there is much in Fourier's writing that is pure nonsense. Yes, like some of the representatives of the early French communist movement, Fourier exhibits that almost characteristic pretension of the visionary: contradictory, confused, repetitive, chaotic, and of course, long-winded. Reading Fourier after having read Marx and Engels, Fourier comes off as a confused thinker. For instance, Fourier's passion for numbers led him to predict that the ideal world he was helping to create would last 80,000 years, 8,000 of them in an era of perfect harmony, in which androgynous plants would copulate, 6 moons would orbit the Earth, the North Pole would be milder than the Mediterranean, the seas would lose their salt and become oceans of lemonade, the world would contain 37 million poets equal to Homer, 37 million mathematicians equal to Newton, and 37 million dramatists equal to Moliere, although these are approximate estimates. Every woman would have 4 lovers or husbands simultaneously. It may be difficult to surmount these difficulties in Fourier's thought, but I think it would be wrong to pass Fourier off as nothing more than an absurd eccentric. After all, even Benjamin Franklin was a bit odd. He believed that men could extend their lifespans indefinitely simply by the power of mind over matter. If one is able to wade through the near endless nonsense which runs rampant through Fourier's writings, one will find that he does offer even the modern reader some fresh and somewhat audacious views of the human condition. If his proposals seem rather extraordinary, if not bizarre by modern standards, his insights into human society and individual psychology remain quite perceptive. Fourier was a relatively isolated thinker. We cannot trace the origin of his ideas with any accuracy. He had no formal academic training and claimed to be bored with the discourses of the philosophers. Working as a traveling salesman during the day and scribbling away in the evenings, he was mocked and ridiculed by his critics. He had no meaningful contacts with any political organizations, nor did his ideas correspond in any clear way either to the early French communists or to the British democratic radicals. This is not to say that we must accept Fourier's claim of originality or epoch-making genius either. Fourier tells us that his ideas had tremendous implications for the future. In his parable, The 4 Apples, Fourier sees history guided by 4 apples. The first 2, Adam and Helen of Troy, were the bad apples. The good apples, on the other hand, were Newton and, yes, you may have guessed it, Fourier himself. Newton had discovered the physical laws of universal attraction. It was up to Fourier, so Fourier, the literate shopkeeper, tells us, to discover the laws of passional attraction. These ideas aside, some of what Fourier says does reflect certain rather typical Enlightenment themes. For instance, reason and nature were key terms in his writings. He called himself the Messiah of reason, and like Rousseau, he criticized bourgeois society for having created an unnatural civilization. Fourier proposed a completely non-repressive society in which basic human drives would not be repressed, but expressed and cultivated. Fourier detested the English for their rapidly emerging industrial society, and for men like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus, who we've all talked about, and other political economists who had done so much to rationalize that system. He held in special contempt the rationally calculating individualism of the utilitarians. They were too intellectual, too rational. In their place, Fourier foresaw a community tied together by the bonds of emotion. Thus, Bentham's system, Jeremy Bentham was a foremost political utilitarian thinker. Thus, Bentham's system, designed as it was to repress human drive and will, was both wrong and impossible. Human nature, Fourier believed, was created by God, and organized society should respect that and not try to fight it. Neither could Fourier accept Rousseau's contempt of the general will, nor Robespierre, nor the Reign of Terror, nor even the Jacobins. Charles Fourier was born into a well-established family of cloth merchants and spent the bulk of his life engaged in commerce. But from an early age, so he tells us, he rebelled against his work, lamenting that it was his fate to be participating in the deceitful activities of merchants and brutalizing myself in the performance of degrading tasks. He spent his early years in Lyon, Portugal, where he observed the efforts of the silk workers to organize themselves. Here too, not Lyon, I think that's Lyon is France, I'm sorry. Here too, he observed I was thinking Lisbon, wrong city, wrong L city. Lyon is in France. Here too, he observed the rampant commercial speculation, the cycles of inflation, and industrial stagnation that prevailed when the free market economy was reestablished under the Directory. Fourier wanted to elevate the status of manual labor, to rescue it from a long-standing tradition of degradation and denigration. But while Fourier was interested in the rational reorganization and efficiency of labor, he by no means accepted the bourgeois work ethic or the older Judeo-Christian notion that work is unavoidably toilsome. For Fourier, all manual labor was arduous and irksome. Whether in the factory, workshop, or field, the plight of the laboring population was intolerably dehumanizing. He believed, on the other hand, that it was possible to make all work into play, to make it pleasurable and desirable and deeply satisfying both physically and mentally. This was perhaps the one vision of Fourier's thought that most captivated other socialist thinkers of the 19th century, including Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The device which Fourier believed would make possible this non-repressive social cohesion, this Eden of joyous labor, he termed phalanstery, a typically untranslatable concept. The term was coined by Fourier to suggest the ancient Greek phalanx, where men were tightly linked together, forming a highly interdependent and impenetrable fighting unit. Fourier's phalanx was to become a self-contained community housing 1,620 members with a myriad of subdivisions designed to encourage a dynamic interplay of various human passions. Why 1,620? Well, Fourier had determined that there are 810 different psychological types. If you multiply this by 2, male and female, you arrive at a figure of 1,620. Here, the law of passional attractions would be allowed to operate unfettered for the first time in history. What Newton had done for physics, Fourier had done for human society. And of course, Fourier believed his discovery to be much more important than Newton's. There are 12 fundamental passions, 5 of the senses, touch, taste, hearing, sight, and smell, 4 of the soul, friendship, love, ambition, and parenthood, and 3 that he called distributive. The first 8 passions are self-explanatory. It is these distributive passions that deserve our closer attention. And it goes on to talk about that, but I'm going to skip over that part. All right? And we're going to skip down to this bottom paragraph right here. Okay? When we turn from Fourier to the ideas and work of Robert Owen, we move into a significantly different historical context. Although Owen was engaged in the textile industry, he was not repelled by his work, nor did he live out his life in an abstract, drug-induced pondering. Instead, Owen became a highly successful cotton manufacturer and entrepreneur who managed to climb the social ladder into the ranks of the wealthy and socially respectable. Owen understood the implications of industrialization better than Fourier and accepted them in a much more positive way. He was much more open to new machinery, new techniques, and new discipline because he saw these improvements as steps on the road to increasing human happiness. In his earliest days, however, Robert Owen appeared to be little more than a benevolent factory owner who made paternalistic improvements in the lives of his employees. He spoke a language that seemed to harken back to a pre-industrial moral economy and a near rejection of commercial civilization. For this reason, Owen attracted the attention of the rural gentry and those politicians whose ideas were anti-modern. Owen's reputation grew after 1800 through his operation of a textile factory in New Lanark, Scotland. Owen had introduced such improvements as shorter working hours, healthier and safer working conditions, after-hours recreation, schools for children and adults, moral education, renovated housing, an end to child labor, and insurance plans financed by payroll deduction. In other words, people would get paid, but part of their paycheck would go to a collective fund of insurance where it could be, those funds could then be used in the event of an accident. What was remarkable about New Lanark was that Owen not only improved the lot of his employees, he managed also to make profits. Before long, New Lanark became a tourist attraction where visitors came to gawk at Owen's social experiment in efficient production. Owen hated the modern factory system, so he decided to revolutionize it. The factory system encouraged social irresponsibility, destructive competition, and heartless individualism. In contrast, pre-industrial society was characterized by a pervasive social conscience, by a belief by the upper orders that they had the duty to look after the poor and unfortunate, and by a strong sense of community among the working classes. In his earliest work, A New View of Society, Owen recommended a plain, simple, practical plan which would not contain the least danger to any individual or to any part of society, and which had the goal of making the poor independent and self-supporting. Although Owen had won the support of the anti-modernizers, it soon became apparent that his ideas and practices had more in common with the democratic radical tradition than with the maintenance of the status quo. In typical 18th century fashion, Owen rejected Christianity and custom and looked to the unique guidance of reason and nature. Owen argued that human nature could be changed. Since we are all products of our environment, one only need change the environment to change man. This environmentalism of Owen's became a cornerstone of all socialist theories and programs of the 19th century. This much said, Owen also went on to reject the democratic radical emphasis on competitive individual effort because his personal experience convinced him that it had unfortunate consequences. Owen was no friend of Thomas Paine. Owen argued that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the test of any system, but unlike Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, he did not believe that the best way to assure human happiness was through the increased productivity of a free market system. Cooperation and harmonious planning would be far superior and far more productive in the interests of society. Owen's first plans for the establishment of a utopian community resembled the phalanx of Fourier, but without the dynamics of the theory of passional attractions. Owen called these settlements villages of cooperation. These villages were self-contained agricultural communities where the unemployed could find productive employment. Owen was confident that his villages would spread rapidly because first, they were based on cooperative labor, and second, they could produce more than private enterprise. However, the villages did not take Britain by storm. He could not obtain enough capital from the government, nor could he find much help from the private sector. Even working class leaders were suspicious of Owen. After all, he was himself a factory master. Between 1805 and 1815, 15,000 visitors came to New Lanark. The villages continued to show profits, but the idea did not spread. One reason why New Lanark did not work was due to its location. New Lanark was dependent on water power rather than steam, and was filled with workers who had to be literally imported into the area. It was a question of timing, I think. New Lanark was operating under conditions that were typical of the initial stages of textile production, conditions which were being rapidly overcome by the rapidly advancing Industrial Revolution. New Lanark was not, properly speaking, a socialist experiment. Owen and his partners owned it, and he directed it personally with very little democratic input or participation from the workers. Private ownership and the profit motive remained in spite of the more humanistic measures that Owen certainly adopted. Thus, the failure of the New Lanark model to spread was not really a failure of a socialist model as it was the failure of Owen's own paternalistic humanitarianism. It must also be mentioned that the type of worker brought to New Lanark was of a rather homogeneous type, Scottish workers of Calvinist backgrounds who were inclined to discipline, uncomplaining labor, and self-improvement. In the early 1820s, and thoroughly frustrated with the blindness of the English, Owen resolved to establish a community in America. So in 1824, Robert Owen sailed for the United States, where he was received in Washington with much fanfare. Then he proceeded to New Harmony, Indiana, where he had purchased a large plot of land. New Harmony was the first and most famous of some 16 Owenite communities that appeared in the United States between 1825 and 1829. None, however, lasted more than a few years as full-fledged socialist communities. New Harmony collapsed when one of Owen's American business partners ran off with all the profits. Another problem at New Harmony was motivational. Many workers came to New Harmony as serious adherents of Owenism. Others, however, came to dance and sing and play. Owen found that he was no longer dealing with the rather hard-working and complacent Scottish workers. The Americans among the Owenites, coming from a democratic tradition, began to have reservations about submitting to Owen's authority, whether paternalist or not. Owen did not spend much time at New Harmony, and the advice he offered once he had arrived was ignored. When confronted with dissension, he urged the colonists to think about what they were doing. In so doing, they would discover the error of their ways and become rational. In the end, however, the eternal principles which Owen claimed to have discovered were not enough to keep New Harmony intact. In 1828, Owen gave up his American adventure and returned to England, where he ended up organizing the working classes until his death 30 years later. By any careful definition, the last guy that we're going to talk about today, Claude Henry de Saint-Simon, cannot be termed a socialist. The term socialist is associated with his name, though, because his followers, collectively known as the Saint-Simonians, became socialists at a later stage. The details of Saint-Simon's life, and even more so the lives of the Saint-Simonians, are colorful and frequently bizarre, a tendency which we have already noticed with Fourier. Duc de Saint-Simon was of ancient noble lineage. One of his ancestors was the famous Duc de Saint-Simon, who recorded the daily affairs of court life under Louis XIV. During his career, Saint-Simon fought alongside Lafayette and the American revolutionaries, and returning to France, narrowly missed the guillotine. During the Directory, he rose to wealth and prominence, only to lose his fortune, suffer a breakdown, and pass some time in an insane asylum. After his death, Saint-Simonian religious cults grew up, proclaiming the advent of a new age, the new Christianity, while others preached orgiastic sexual liberation. By the time of the Second French Empire, 1850s and 60s, bankers, industrialists, and prominent government officials professed admirations for the ideas of Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonians. Compared to the experience of either Fourier or Owen, Saint-Simon's position in society never really put him in touch with the realities of industrialism. His experience under the Directory is worth noting in this respect. As a friend and associate of the financiers and speculators who flourished during the Thermidorian reaction, he was just the kind of person who was detested by men like Fourier or Babeuf. Where Fourier and Babeuf saw corruption and an almost immoral lack of concern for the common person, Saint-Simon saw expertise and enterprise. Where they had looked to capitalist growth with a suspicious eye, Saint-Simon welcomed it. Where they detested England and its social system, he was an ardent Anglophile, meaning he loved England. And where they were repelled by the falseness and unnaturalness of Parisian society, Saint-Simon enjoyed the company of brilliant artists, scientists, and men of affairs whom he encountered at the fashionable salons. For some time, Saint-Simon appeared to be a typical liberal aristocrat, a man who spoke a language favorable to the emerging liberal and progressive bourgeoisie. Yet Saint-Simon was something consistently more than a liberal, more than a simple-minded defender of laissez-faire capitalism. As his thought became more refined, he became more and more concerned with the dangers inherent in uncontrolled individualism. More than either Owen or Fourier, Saint-Simon perceived the ramifications of the new industrialism of his own time, and he attempted to place his perceptions into a broad theoretical framework. He idealized productivity, organization, efficiency, innovation, and technological discovery. However, this does not mean that these ends could be achieved in a free market economy. Saint-Simon condemned kings, nobles, and the clergy as useless and parasitical. That was a familiar enough theme for the period. He believed that in a previous stage of historical development, kings, nobles, and priests served a necessary role. It was only now, under new conditions, that they had become socially useless. The aristocracy was now an anachronism, out of place in time, and served as an obstacle to the new social order which Saint-Simon saw emerging around him. Even these obstacles, Saint-Simon thought, were to be expected. Had not all recorded history been little more than the record of conflict between one group coming into power and an older group who could no longer maintain its power? While Saint-Simon incorporates the working classes into his vision of the future, the workers do not play a dominant or even important position, which differentiates his work from Karl Marx. While manual labor would be honored and the parasitical orders banned, what would distinguish the new system was not so much labor, but labor's reorganization and the application of technology to it. Thus, the highest position of prestige and authority would be assumed by a meritocratic elite of intelligence and creativity, the technocracy. Saint-Simon was undeniably elitist. He saw no reason to conclude that manual laborers could, on their own, organize and run an efficient and rational new order. They had the need of the authority and direction of an elite cadre of technocrats. Saint-Simon's ideas lent themselves to various reinterpretations. By 1830, 5 years after his death, his followers split into several factions. Those heading in a socialist direction built upon his rejection of individualist selfishness and rationalism and his concern for social solidarity and interdependent responsibility. They popularized Saint-Simon's ideas and tried to make them more attractive to the working classes. In seeking greater support, the socialists among the Saint-Simonians also began to question the institution of private property, especially from the standpoint of inheritance laws, whereby the children of rich parents obtained wealth without personal merit or service to society. Saint-Simon defended private property as the reward for achievement, but he did not view it as a sacred or natural right. Private property was little more than an institution useful in the organization of industrial productivity. The Saint-Simonians put this attack on the rights of inheritance into context of a liberation of the most numerous class. and as part of a program to enhance productivity. The end of inheritance was not a step toward communist egalitarianism. In the last analysis, a key contribution of Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonians was to link socialism solidly with the notion of progress through industrialization. This had the effect of breaking away from the backward-looking tendencies of Babeuf's communism and the tendency to conceive of socialism as best achieved in isolated agricultural communities. This and the identification of socialism with the working class would be a central theme of the 1830s and 40s, moving utopian socialism away from its initial escapist tendencies toward an integration into historically rooted movements and concrete social and economic realities. In other words, the ideas of the utopian socialists began to percolate down to the working classes themselves, and especially their socialist representatives among them. So, that brings us to the end of that reading. And I know that that was a long reading, but I feel like it's kind of necessary in order for you guys to have a complete idea of the ideas of these early utopian socialists, who really made up different aspects of this utopian socialist movement. Even though each of them was individually very different from one of themselves, they all kind of subscribed to this idea that of introducing progress and change in the name of restructuring industrial society into something that was more efficient, but also embraced the spirit, the spirit of the soul, right? The soul of the laborer, and not just reducing people to mindless cogs in an industrial machine. Okay, so continuing on in the PowerPoint here, a wave of revolutions leading up to the 1830 revolutions of France. A wave of revolutions throughout Europe that started in France in the form of the July Revolution that resulted in the overthrow of Charles X, a Bourbon monarch, and the installment of Louis Philippe until 1848, known as the July Monarchy. Sometimes Louis Philippe, remember, is also known as the bourgeois king. Ironically, Louis Philippe would himself be overthrown in the revolutions of 1848. The effects of this revolution in France, which lasted 3 days, sometimes called the Three Glorious Days, are as followed. The creation of a constitutional monarchy, the Chamber of Peers, the upper house of the French Parliament, was converted from a hereditary body to a nominated house, though those nominated retained their life memberships. And then the alliance between the monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church was abolished. And a month later, the Belgian Revolution would begin against the Netherlands and the despotic rule of William I. This would result in the installment of King Leopold I as the leader of the independent Kingdom of Belgium. Also, the Italians, Poles, who were fighting against Russia, and Germanic people also staged uprisings at this time, but were forcibly put down and unsuccessful. Italy had revolts in the Papal States, Parma, and Modena. Austria sent in troops and suppressed all of the revolts. However, it awakened Italian nationalism, and after that, we would see Italy start progressing down the road of becoming unified. And then Greece, which we talked about last class, had already been fighting for their independence from the Ottomans, and their independent state was officially recognized by the London Protocol in 1832, which we already talked about. So when we talk about, as we move throughout the rest of this PowerPoint, this is just kind of a preview of things to come, okay? Each of these things here is going to be stuff that we talk about in this upcoming PowerPoint. Let's just really quickly remind you about the Corn Laws. Remember that the Corn Laws were a protective tariff on British grain, okay, where all foreign grain that came from outside Britain was taxed. And then the Anti-Corn Law League was against the Corn Laws. They wanted to get them repealed, and their goal was free trade. and they lasted a long time. The Corn Laws were in place for about 30 years, but they do get repealed in 1846. One of the reactions to the Corn Laws was sometimes called the Battle of Peterloo, or the Peterloo Massacre, which you've learned about before. This happened in Manchester in 1819, and it was a riot against the Corn Laws at the time, and 15 people were killed and another 400 to 700 people were injured in the Peterloo Massacre. All right, let's talk about the revolutions of 1830 here. The revolutions of 1838 and this 1830, and this is going to be in France. So, sparked by a wave of liberalism and nationalism against perceived conservative oppression. Remember that after the Congress of Vienna, one of the main ideas was to put legitimate monarchs back on the throne. And the Bourbon dynasty, after the fall of Napoleon, was placed back on the French throne because they had been the dynasty that was in power before the French Revolution began. But the people of France really didn't like the Bourbon dynasty at all. And so the Bourbon dynasty, was under harsh criticism from particularly French liberals and nationals, which there were a lot of because of the influence of the French Revolution and Napoleon for so long. So by the time that we get to the year 1830, we see something happen in France known as the July Revolution. What happened was that King Charles X, who was the Bourbon king, sought to impose absolutism by rolling back the constitutional monarchy. Remember that even though they put the Bourbon dynasty back on the throne in France, France was supposed to remain a constitutional monarchy like Britain was. In response, a radical revolt in Paris forced the reactionary conservative Charles X to abdicate his throne, to give up the throne. Louis Philippe would be the guy who replaces him as King of France. And he came from the Orleans family, and he became the new king under a constitutional monarchy and became nicknamed the Bourgeois King, because at least on the surface, he was supposed to be more liberal and favoring of the bourgeois class. Likewise, he was also supported by the wealthy bourgeoisie, the upper middle class. And he even acted and dressed like them rather than dressing like an aristocrat or king. So that's how he got the nickname Bourgeois King. Now, when Louis Philippe comes to power as King of France as the Bourgeois King, he does make changes that were in favor of the upper bourgeoisie, but not the lower bourgeoisie or the working class. Louis Philippe, we need to be clear, even though he's named the Bourgeois King, he's not really, his career, people don't look back on him as being a king of the people, okay? Louis Philippe really did not do that much for the vast majority of the population of France. He practiced a form of politics that a lot of politicians do, which is that if you're already super wealthy, as many politicians are before they come to power, they end up, putting their buddies into positions of power. They end up, really only looking out for the needs of other wealthy people who are their friends. And, and this has even happened in America. I mean, it's not surprise. It's something that's very commonplace. They call it political cronyism, okay? And so Louis Philippe, when he came to power, he was really looking out for other people of his own economic status, looking out for the interests of those wealthy upper-end bourgeois people, not for lower bourgeois or working class people. And over time, this is going to whittle away at his ability to retain his control. He does slightly increase voting qualifications to include about 200,000 people, but you have to understand, France has a population of many, many, many million people by this point. 200,000 people is a pittance. in comparison to the overall population of France. And under Louis Philippe, the lesser bourgeois class and the working class basically get nothing. Louis Philippe sponsored industrialization via growth of the urban working class. And so actually, as Louis Philippe is king, France is starting to undergo some of those same industrial changes to the population that England was going through just a decade earlier. And Louis Philippe used force against the workers. He even got an army to put down the violence and censored the press. And so Louis Philippe, on the surface, as much as he's supposed to be this kind of pro-liberal, pro-bourgeois guy, he ends up really kind of being pretty partial to the interests of a very select few of extremely wealthy merchant business folks in France, and more or less subjecting the rest of the population to the brutalities of industrial capitalism emerging at this time. Here you can see that famous painting I told you about, Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People in 1830. This is that giant portrait that hangs on the wall of the Louvre Museum in France. And shortly after the coming of power of Louis Philippe in France in 1830, shortly thereafter, there was a revolution in the Netherlands, the Dutch Revolution, the former Austrian Netherlands, which are now known as Belgium. Okay, so remember that for a long time, the Habsburgs controlled the Austrian Netherlands, which was Belgium. Okay, and it's not until 1830 that we see the Austrian Habsburgs lose control over the Austrian Netherlands, and they break away and they become the Belgium. They were attached to the Dutch Netherlands, but they were culturally different. Remember that the Austrian Netherlands, aka Belgium, all right, were culturally different than the Dutch Netherlands, even though they border one another. In case you're wondering, by the way, where I'm talking about, I feel like I should just pull this up real quick for you because it's sometimes a little bit confusing for kids. We're talking about the Low Countries. Let's just pull up map of Europe. And so we'll go to maps. And we'll zoom in right here. This is what I'm talking about. Here's where Austria is. It's down over here, right? Austria is down here. This was the Austrian Netherlands, Belgium, okay? So you can see they're quite a distance away. Remember, Austria's empire rests all the way down here, okay? This is where nowadays you don't see Austrian Empire on the map now because there are no empires anymore. It's all nation states. But at the time, this was the Austrian Empire down here. And the Austrian Netherlands were up here, and they were very important to the Austrian Empire because Antwerp was a major port that traded stuff and was close to London and stuff like that. But in 1830, the Austrian Netherlands, the Belgians, start breaking away from Austrian control and establish their own state. However, they do border the Netherlands to the north, which previously, if you remember, had been controlled by Spain. And the Dutch Netherlands broke away from Spanish control a long, long time ago, back in the 1600s, when they became the Dutch Republic. But now they are two independent nation states, the Netherlands and Belgium. Culturally, though, they're very different from one another. They don't speak the same language. Even the Belgians inside Belgium, there's different kinds of Belgians. There's the French Belgians, and then there's the Belgian Belgians, sometimes called the Flemish and the Walloons. Okay, and even within Belgium, you have some cultural differences where the Flemish and the Walloons don't really get along with one another. And so, anyhow, okay, so that's that. So, Belgium successfully won its independence from the Dutch Republic and from Austria, and it became its own nation state. Britain. In Britain, we start to see some reforms passed in 1832. The reforms of 1832 did not yet get rid of the Corn Laws, but one of the things that does happen during the reforms of 1832 is they start to make laws that improve the lives of the poor industrial working class who had been going through really tough transitions during the Industrial Revolution, and their lives had become quite miserable. And I'm going to actually do this right now so that I don't forget to do it in a minute here. But I'd like to show you, I'd like you all for the end of class today, because we're going to finish up with this today, is to watch this. This right here. I'd like you to watch this video by Tom Ritchie. And I don't always show Tom Ritchie videos, but this is a good one that will give you a background on what you need to know on the Reform Act of 1832 and the kinds of changes that got put into place in Britain at that stage of the Industrial Revolution. And there will be other reform acts as well as we continue to move forward in history. But the Reform Act of 1832 was an important one along several steps along the way of reforms that were made in Britain to try to smooth out the grievances and anger and hostility of the working classes who were really living just miserable lives at that time. So to finish up class today, please watch that video, and that will bring you right up to the end of class. And we will start with the revolutions of 1848 on Wednesday. Be looking out for a new reading guide assignment that I'm going to post in just a couple minutes here, and get that done by Wednesday morning. And we'll see you then, folks. Have a wonderful day.